name's Doug Smith. I'm the Vice President of the Portsmouth Historical Society, and we're here today with Jacob Bagan, who's going to talk to us about cemeteries. And it's part of what we're trying to do is update the cemetery inventory here in Portsmouth. And Jacob's talk today is kind of the kickoff of that project, which is going to be a long-term project over the next year, probably for several years intermittently thereafter. So Jacob, welcome to Portsmouth, and
Thank you.
We look forward to your talk.
So originally I began looking at cemeteries as an artistic muse. I began studying them in college as a photographer, and I was taking pictures of them about 15 years ago. And I became interested in just the aesthetics of them.
Okay.
That led to me going to grad school and studying them as a photographer and an anthropologist, and then more grad school essentially. I eventually became part of the Cemetery Commission in Bristol. I also interned with the statewide Cemetery Commission, and now I work for the state DOT as a historic preservation specialist, where we deal with a lot of cemetery issues in terms of roadway,
Sure.
repaving and things like that, and the state Cemetery Act, in which if we do work within 25 feet of a cemetery or in a cemetery, we're required to do certain permitting, essentially.
Okay, everyone, welcome. I'm Jim Garman, the President of the Historical Society. We're glad to have such a great turnout here today. Our speaker is Jacob Bagan, who works for the state in the historic cemetery part of RIDOT, right?
That's correct.
That's right. So, and he's going to show us a little bit about cemeteries, gravestones, and things like that. And hopefully this is the takeoff for us for doing an evaluation of cemeteries in the town. This is a project the Historical Society has ongoing, along with Gary Crosby, who's doing it for the comprehensive plan. So I hope you all learned something. I know we all will. And so I'll turn it over to Jacob to talk to everybody.
Thank you. Welcome. This is a large turnout. So, as Jim said, my name is Jacob Bagan, and I am a historic preservation specialist at RIDOT. I'm on the Bristol Historical Cemetery Commission, and I began looking at gravestones about 15 years ago as a muse in art school as a photographer. Just interested in the way that they looked and the way that the landscape looked. And so I started taking pictures of them, and that drew me into a sort of deeper world. From there, I went to grad school and studied them in various media and academic forms, and about maybe 10 years after that, I started working for the state and became very interested in the preservation of them. So, here we are today. So, I have cards with me because I can go off on tangents, and I try to stick to that. Why Portsmouth Cemetery? It's, if you're like me, you've probably driven by this cemetery hundreds of times, especially if you live on the island or around, come to the island. And driving by this cemetery hundreds of times to get onto the highway, I've never actually pulled into this cemetery until the Historical Society asked me to give a talk. And so I pulled in, and what I found here was just a variety, an assortment of different stones, from all periods of the history of this region and of the state. Really what we have here is sort of what I would call a vernacular cemetery. It's nothing special when you look at it. It's pretty, it's well maintained. It's not Mount Auburn or any of the famous cemeteries that you might have seen. But when you start to look around, you find a lot of interesting things here. And what I mean by vernacular is that it started as a small family plot owned by the Anthonys, the Anthony family. And as Mr. Chase has explained to me, there's a much longer history here, but it eventually expanded into a privately owned cemetery with about 1,000 burials here. So, make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Yeah, okay, so there's probably 3 takeaways that I want you to
many of the stones have fallen down.
Leave with today. One would be that this is really folk art here. The people who made the stones, you'll especially see this when you look at some of the colonial stones. These were made by folk artists, really. It was a secondary income to them, especially in the early going. These weren't professional artists, they were folk artists. They were masons, tanners, house wrights, and they made a little extra money on the side. But it truly is artwork that they made, and some of it was the earliest sculpture in America, the earliest art forms in America. And these cemeteries become these outdoor museums, essentially. The second takeaway is the sheer amount of information that you have here, and that we as spectators are allowed to interface with these stones. And they become giant databases of a town's history. The third takeaway, and probably the most important, is destruction and preservation. This cemetery is not so bad, it's very well maintained. You won't see a lot of this here, you might see some, but when you leave here, and especially if you volunteer or decide to stop in at a cemetery on the side of the road like I did here and like you have now, you'll see that many of the stones have fallen down, are chipped, broken, you can't read them anymore. And in a broader context, many of those stones statistically are gone now. So say over the last 100 years, about 50% of them are no longer there anymore. They're either disintegrated into rubble, buried underground, and for various other reasons just gone. So if you picture, fast forward to 100 years from now, they'll all be gone. And what we can do to preserve them is very important, and I think that's an effort that the Portsmouth Historical Society and the town as a whole is making an effort that other towns are not making, and that's very important. One of the ways that we can preserve gravestones is not by coming in here trying to prop them up, pour concrete bases, dig them up, clean them, make grave rubbings. We don't do that anymore. The thing that we do is we take a piece of paper, we write down what's there, we record the last time we saw it, and probably the most important thing that we do is we take pictures of them. For a number of reasons. When you take especially a digital photograph of something, you can zoom in with your fingers on your phone or on the computer. You can zoom in, you can read everything about it, and you can say that that was there at this point in time, and it gives you just this incredible ability to read all the information that's there. So that's very important. Today is probably the worst possible day, aside from a hurricane, for photographing a gravestone. So that part of our talk might be kind of nixed and might be a little bit shorter. Normally I'd like to show you how to take a really great picture of a gravestone. We probably won't be doing that today, but I can still give you some tips here and there on how it would be done. I'll try to mimic what it would be done on like a sunny day and how to sort of create a outdoor studio setting. But having said that, I think I've covered everything that I'd like to cover for that. Let's move to some of the first stones that we want to look at. You're a big group, just kind of move along. Okay, so the beginnings of this cemetery start with Burrington Anthony, or at least the Anthony family, and one of the progenitors of that family is Burrington Anthony. And we talked briefly about destruction and preservation, and sometimes destruction is just by the attrition of time. So here is Mr. Anthony, Burrington Anthony Esquire. And what's the problem with the stone? Well, and also I also discussed sunny days, reading stones, things of that nature. Well, you can't read this stone, but luckily it not being a sunny day, I've written down most of what the stones say. So this one essentially says, well, he may be the oldest, and he was born in 1741, died in 1841 at the ripe old age of 100. But more importantly, the stone says he served his country as an officer in the American Revolution. So we have a Revolutionary War veteran here who has almost been faded, and so is his memory. Now that to me is, as being one of the earlier stones here, or the earlier people buried here, is kind of a shame to me. And I thought I'd bring your attention to that. However, it is still here. His son, who I think is here, also named Burrington. So a lot of these stones have implications beyond just Portsmouth, but the history of Rhode Island. His son, Burrington, was a large supporter of Thomas Wilson Dorr, who was, of course, led the Dorr's Rebellion, which was, if you don't know, sort of the Civil War of Rhode Island, and owned a house, Burrington did, on Atwells Avenue in Providence, which was the Providence headquarters of the Dorr's Rebellion in 1841. And it was there that Dorr gave this speech, and he had cannons ready to go to fight the rest of his opponents. The cannons never lit, they fizzled out, and so did his rebellion. Dorr's Rebellion was to sort of empower more people to be able to vote in the state. At that time, only white male landowners were allowed to vote. Eventually, he went to prison and then was pardoned, and as we know now, more people are allowed to vote as a result of that, not just white landowners. So that's Burrington. Next, okay, so I talked about folk art a little bit, and Aquidneck Island especially has a very rich history of 18th century, 1700s stone carving tradition. Maybe we could first look at, yeah, here we have, which is it's a Stephen shop. This is Elizabeth Almy. And so in the 18th century in Rhode Island, there's sort of a lot of carving that goes on, and this is a Stephen shop. What you see is trends, basically. You'll see a death's head. Okay, so there's trends in 18th century carving that you'll see in any old burial ground. And you can tell the old ones from the sort of later ones. So you'll see a death's head, right? And this is a pretty good classic death's head. It's really rudimentary, like any of these really early ones are. A skull and crossbones, we call that a death's head. It's sort of a grim reminder of death, very puritanical. Later on, you'll see stuff that shows the sort of softening that we associate with, especially the freedom of religion in Rhode Island. We call those soul effigies. They won't be a skull. It'll be more like a cheruby sort of angelic face, or more humanoid. And then later on after that, we would see a more sentimental look at religion, which would be something like an urn and a willow tree. But let's talk about the Stevens shop real briefly. So this is the first generation, John Stevens, the first. He came to Newport, and if you go to Thames Street in Newport, you will see the John Stevens shop. 6 generations, the oldest operating business in America. The oldest operating business in America, still running, is on Thames Street in Newport, and it is a stone carving shop. They were originally masons, but they did stone carvings. That's incredible. And in 1705, Stevens moved from Boston down here to Newport and set up his shop. And 6 generations of Stevens. It's now owned by the Benson family, and they're still carving gravestones. They've carved the Benson family has carved some of the most famous lettering, typography that you'll see, including the Vietnam War memorial in Washington, D.C., the World War II memorial, the JFK memorial in Arlington Cemetery. Their work is incredible. And if you ever get a chance, just, start to look around. You'll see it in Rhode Island, on banks, on monuments. The Providence train station the train station has a carving that was done by John Howard Benson, who was the 2nd generation there. So they've been going strong. This is also, I believe, a Stevens shop. I believe it's a 2nd generation. It's a little hard to tell. I think that it's I want to say Philip Stevens. He had supposedly about 4 sons. It's a little hard to tell for sure. So these folk artists, it's so much more than just a carving. It's really a signature. It's like they left their signature. They each have their own distinctive style. Aside from being a memorial to the person that's buried here, if you look at the typography and the lettering, they're all different, and that's usually how a gravestone historian, can tell who carved it. And it's very meticulous work. A lot of it's been laid out by various people, such as Vincent Ludi. If you ever get a chance to read something by him, I would recommend that. There's another good one, one over here. I believe this one is Abigail Anthony. Right, so that is that? Okay, so again, this is a little difficult to see on a cloudy day, but this was, that was carved by William Throop. William Throop was a Bristol carver. He had a shop also on Thames Street on the DeWolf Wharf, and he was a tanner by trade. His shop was blown away in a gale in the early 19th century, 1815, thereabout. His carvings tend to sort of rip off a little bit some of the Stevens shop, you'll notice, but he does also have his own distinctive style, and he he has a large geographic range. He'll be all over Rhode Island. You can see his stones, and some in Massachusetts. These stones are mostly slate, and a lot of the Stevens shop in particular would have been slate that you would find on the island. There's actually would have been quarried locally. You can tell the difference in the slate by the color of it usually, like where geographically it would have come from. Aquidneck Island in this region, slate, it has a blue color to it, a bluish tint. You can really see it. It's beautiful. I think this is also probably Aquidneck Island. Some of the other slates you'll see will have a more darker gray and sometimes even almost a brownish tint to it. But you can start to see there's some carvers from Attleboro area, Rehoboth area, closer to East Providence. That John New being a major one who carved stones all over the southern Boston area. That it's just night and day when you start to look at them side by side, the different colors of the slate and where it was quarried. But in Aquidneck Island, the Stevens really had a sort of strong hold on it. And if you are interested in seeing some of the more beautiful and spectacular Stevens carvings, such as John Stevens III became the real artist of the family. He was a third generation and carved portrait stones and all sorts of beautiful things. John Bull is another one of these Aquidneck Island carvers. Go to Common Burial Ground in Newport, and there's hundreds of examples. You can walk around there all day and see just the most amazing and intricate carvings. It's really worth a trip, and now that you sort of have some of the names, you might be able to start to pick out a few, and it's worth a trip there. Also, Island Cemetery is also worth it. It's connected to it. So on another note, Rhode Island is often associated with maritime history. And when you start to look around this cemetery, other cemeteries, any cemetery, you'll really start to see little signs and symbols. And the second you notice them, they're everywhere. These men mostly were fishers, whalers, slave traders. And I'm always interested to see how much people understand what degree our history is tied to things like whaling and slave trading. But it is extraordinary. So this stone's for Captain John Earl. It has a anchor on it, simply put, and it says that he died on his voyage to Hispaniola. I can tell you from wandering around cemeteries for a while and studying American history that he wasn't going to Hispaniola for whaling purposes or for fishing purposes. A major part of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, was located in the Caribbean. So he was probably either delivering slaves there via Western Africa, or he was collecting cane to deliver here to either Newport or possibly Bristol to make to the rum distilleries. Briefly, without knocking you over the head with it, in America, what happened in terms of slavery was a sort of gradual emancipation. In 1794, and I believe he died in 1796, it's hard to read, at around the age of 33. That would be right around the time where either a captain or a mate on a ship would probably be at the height of their travels. So in 1794 was the first law that passed, essentially outlawing slavery and the transportation by ship of slaves. And gradually, these laws strengthened in their penalties. In 1808, and then I believe again in 1810, they became stronger, the penalties. And however, 2 years after the first one, if there was money to be made, the captains still did it. And especially in towns and cities like Newport and Bristol, the sort of capillaries and arteries of the slave trade really touch almost every family there. And you can trace this in a town like Bristol, where I've studied a lot of stuff, to nearly every facet of the town's history. It's fascinating. So as you walk around and you start to see captains and things like that, you'll really notice little histories like that. All right, I think we've spent enough time over here. Yeah, oh, okay, yes. Go ahead.
All of these stones in a row, they seem to be from different families kind of things. Is that so? I mean, are they all cousins?
Yeah, I haven't looked at them all. I'm guessing that they were probably if I were to guess, I would say that at one point they were probably moved. They were probably picked up and reset for the purposes of maintenance. They're probably close to where they're originally located. You notice also that there's no footstones. Usually they had a headstone and a footstone. The footstones are probably gone now. They might have been on the ground. They might have been picked up. There's a lot of different reasons for it. They might be, I'm sure there was a limited number of families in the area at that time. If you look at this cemetery in reference to, so quickly, Portsmouth, right? 1600s. Anne Hutchinson and her followers come, they settle at Founder's Brook, which is directionally that way, okay? Right? Shortly thereafter, roughly 100 years or so, they're looking for a new area to settle. They settle in Newtown, okay? A lot of these families here, yeah, I look to Jim. So they settle in Newtown, and they basically abandon Founder's Brook, more or less. And in Newtown, they set up what becomes basically the center of Portsmouth until the automobile, which ruins so much of our history and gives me a job at the Department of Transportation. And a lot of these families here, you'll notice, if you start to look at the names, a lot of them lived in Newtown, and a lot of them had houses on Turnpike Avenue and around here. A lot of those houses still stand today. Some of them don't, but so there was a small number of families, and they married each other. So a lot of them would be cousins, and Gifford, Fish, Anthony. You know the names because the streets are named after them, and the roads are named after them, and so there's a very good chance that this one was related to this one very closely. And then they branch out a little bit, and there's immigration and things like that, and you get an influx of more families and whatnot. So yeah, there's a lot of different reasons why you see things like that.
I have one question.
Go ahead.
When you were talking about that law about diminishing the child
Gradual emancipation, yeah.
was that was that Rhode Island or federal?
That was a federal law. Yep.
How much is below ground?
Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about the anatomy, what I like to call the anatomy of a gravestone. We'll talk about that next.
And you mentioned that now we are more preserving and recording what's on the gravestones and not fixing them. So, I mean, that one that you mentioned, Mr. Earl.
Yep.
Somebody isn't going to try to write it and.
Well, okay, so as amateur preservationists, which includes me, let's leave that to the professionals. There are professional people who work as people who even maintain the cemeteries, and then professional gravestone preservationists who know how to do that, have studied preservation work, particularly specifically gravestones. They know the right way to do it.
But that's good, somebody is doing it.
Not all the time, and I'm not going to lie to you, a lot of times it won't happen. There's not enough of it, no. And that's why I said you'll start to notice there is a lot of destruction in these cemeteries. A lot. I can show you cemeteries where they are destroyed. And not just this cemetery is destroyed. This extremely significant cemetery, which should be preserved to the point that it is a National Historic Landmark, in my opinion, is crumbled to nothing. And piles of gravestones are off in a section where there's trees just kind of thrown so that we can mow them properly. A lot of times what was happening is that people were using weed whackers to trim around them. It makes the cemetery look nice, but on colonial slate, it chips them to nothing. So awareness is a big thing. Having a group of 30 people come here brings awareness to this cemetery and says, hey, maybe I shouldn't, I don't know, walk on that stone. Maybe the next time I bring my kid to, my wife's pregnant right now, I'm thinking a lot about bringing my future daughter to cemeteries. I'll teach them that this is our history and this is something worth preserving, and there's good parts and bad parts about it, our history, but it's at least worth, keeping in mind. So,
Thank you.
yes, sir.
There's a very small marker in the ground here.
Yeah, that looks like a,
I guess the other question that relates to this is, what about flat markers versus
yeah.
vertical markers?
Okay, so ground lying markers are just a different style of marker. They're usually more modern. They are almost always, they're more modern. You'll see some older ones too. I think that's a war. That would not be a ground lying marker. That one fell over.
Oh, okay.
You do see them, early gravestones were what you sometimes called wolf stones, were put there in order to, some of the earliest stones you'll see, which usually are no longer even found, were put there to just, as I say, or what the name references, to keep predators away. Maybe that's where the tradition comes from, I don't know. I think that's a military stone. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
1890, 1935.
I don't know. It looks like it's what, bronze, I'm guessing? Yeah. So, it's a stylistic change. With technology came a lot of different styles of stones. It looks like it was probably very inexpensive to make, so it might have been just someone who didn't have a lot of money but still wanted to mark the burial. It's probably not a military stone if it was a female from the 19th century. But this is what you do. You unlock the mysteries, right? You look it up, you start to read about it. It gives you limited information, but from that you can draw answers, right? Does somebody over here have another question? Yeah, so this is probably the coolest, most interesting part of the cemetery when you start to look at it, but I guarantee you can do this like deep reading with any part of this cemetery. Yes?
Jacob, I just wanted to tell you that these stones here
Yes.
were brought here from another cemetery.
They were, okay.
That's why they're so close together
Okay.
and they're so short. The very little bit of remains that came with them
Yeah.
got buried in that small area.
Now,
behind
were
the
these
stone.
from the Methodist church?
I think these came from a private cemetery, I think, down on Willow Lane,
Okay.
and were moved here for, they had to do away with the cemetery.
So how would the Anthonys fit into that?
Burrington Anthony's farm was where the Carnegie Abbey Club is.
Okay. All right, is that cemetery there anymore?
Yeah, probably not.
All right, so the Anthony family moved their remains here.
But that happened, 60 years ago or better,
Okay.
Excuse me,
All right.
Dave. Ron Chase is the president of the Cemetery Corporation.
He was telling me that earlier.
I just want, if you saw any dates that were out of line with how long the cemetery's been here, or space in between them, that's why.
Okay.
These were all moved here, and there was very little remains left to be buried with each one.
We should give this tour together, side by side. Okay, so let's move on. Let's move on to another. Okay, on a sunny day, I had great plans to bring a mirror, an umbrella, have you all whip out your little digital cameras and cell phones and take a picture. That is not going to work because there's no sun. So instead, I will tell you that what you would do is sort of hold the mirror here. It would rake the sun across here. You would be able to illuminate the stone, and it would be beautiful, and you'd be able to take a great picture of it. So in lieu of that, we'll talk about the anatomy of a gravestone, which Mr. Garman sort of brought up. So in the earlier stones, they sort of all have the same look, and you might have, noted that. You might have said, they all look the same. What's the deal with that? They have this tripartite style, 3 bumps. They have a tympanum, or a lunette. They have 2 finials. Let's see, what else I want to do. Okay, yeah, they have these border panels, borders, and then they have a tablet where most of the information is, an epitaph and just biographical information. So this is a headstone, and normally it would be accompanied by a footstone here, approximately. The footing of the gravestone. So this is the above ground portion. These are large pieces of stone. Underneath the ground here, what you do not see is usually one of 2 things. It would either go down straight. A lot of times it would look like a whale's tail. And that was for a number of reasons. One, because this point here is going to be the weakest point. If you were to hit this, it would probably crack right there. But having it in there set like that is going to give it a little more power. But if you do see them still and something impacts it that hard, a lot of times the crack and the point where they're broken will be right there, and people will say, wow, it's kind of like that's how deep it is. Usually there's a large footing underneath to ground it and to keep it in there. It's also the reason why a lot of times these stones you'll see kind of crooked and like that, and to reset them is really difficult to do. When they do get reset, they'll take the cracked part and give it a new footing. I don't see any necessarily, but they might reset it in something like this, a concrete footing. But all right, the interactive portion of our talk. What does this look like to you? What does it remind you of? A gravestone, yes. Sure does. And in fact, it is. To me, I mean, if it had a headstone and a footstone, one of the things that people would say a lot of times is it looks like a bed. Somebody said, God and sleep, and all these ideas come up a lot of the times. The terms I'm using, I don't know if you're familiar. So I said a lot of the carvers were house rights. I'm using terms like finial and tympanum and panel and lunette. These are architectural terms. So when we talk about gravestones, a lot of the people who started studying them were architectural historians. And they not only were using terminology from architecture, they look like doorways. They look like pieces of your house. A lot of you, if you live in an older house or even a newer house, you might have a lunette above your doorway. That might even look like your door a little bit. And a lot of the stone carvers were trained in this sort of style, and they were borrowing from architecture. And sometimes, literally, they were using books that came from Europe, and they were using symbols and things like that that they saw in books until they formed their own language. Stevens was, oops, sorry, little bump there. Stevens specifically was able to sort of craft his own early language, and this became the building blocks amongst a lot of Boston carvers before him. There were the building blocks, the language of death, basically. So when you look at these things, and this will translate into maybe the next stone that we look at, this becomes the language of how we talk about and view death. And it might be on a subconscious level, but you'll notice that the symbols and the words that we use are related to some of these earlier symbols and stones and things like that. So, having said that, let's move on to another stone. Okay, so I was talking a little bit about the sort of language, and this stone is incredibly hard to read. I tried to clean it off before you guys got here. I did not do an extremely successful job, but I promise it was in much worse shape before you got here. But I wrote down what it says, or the part I want to read. So Giffords, right? That's a good Portsmouth name. The stone, the one with the flag next to it, I think at the bottom, they all have sort of these sentimentalized epitaphs, quotes, yeah. A little bit of poetry. And this one that I pointed out says, "As you pass by, cast an eye. As you are now, so once was I." This is about the most generic bit of poetry that you can find on a gravestone. Some might like it. I personally do not. And you might tell from my sort of mocking tone, I'm not really a huge fan of that type of language on gravestones, for a number of reasons. One, it really tells us nothing about the person that's buried there, other than maybe they really followed the trends of the times. Two, it doesn't tell us anything about the person, the artisan, the craftsman who carved the stone. And also gives us very little extraordinary biographical information about this person. And three, this has become the sort of standard by which we view gravestones. If you walk by on Halloween by someone's house, they've sort of put up these little makeshift scenes in front of their houses. They always say something like that, you know, cast an eye, as you are now, so once was I. It's not even good poetry. It uses the word I and I. It's bad. I'm not a fan. So this is the standard by which we think. When we think of gravestones, we think of this. Yet, as we've already seen and will continue to see, there's so much more to this landscape. There's so much more depth, and there's so much more information to be derived from a stone and these memories culturally than something like that, really. So I challenge everyone to think a little bit further than something like that, at least when you're setting up your Halloween decorations. So, you know, take a quick look as you walk by if you haven't gotten a chance, but I'd like us to consider something in our next stone that you would probably walk by as maybe being maybe a little bit more blasé, but I would argue that it isn't. So we'll continue on to the next one. Okay, so instead consider Jose Moses, a modern stone, but what information can we derive from this form? An image of the deceased. Very simple, very modern. But I would argue gives us much more information about the person. And the design of the stone, which is polished black granite, I favor. Stones like this are sometimes described to me as sort of ugly and modern and things like that, but the style of it begs you to sort of engage, if you knew the person personally, and if you did not, to reflect on a sort of cultural memory. And I'll show you how. First off, the plant is wilted and dead, so that's not great, but when you were either photographing this stone or coming here to visit, you sit down and you are literally reflected in the stone. You view the person, an image of them, and if you were to try to take a picture, I challenge you to do that without having yourself taken in it. It is impossible. It forces you to sort of like have this direct interaction with this person and with a memory, whether it's yours or a memory of in general. And it makes you think and just sort of ponder the whole process basically that's going on here. And I think that's really what a gravestone is supposed to do, and this whole landscape essentially is supposed to do. It's supposed to make you think and reflect on what's happening here. And this really does it reflectively, correctly. If you walk behind, simple information. Jose and Moses, birth and death date, brief biographical information. Loving husband, father, son, and friend. Really tells you all you need to know. If we were anthropologists in 100 years from now, that would tell us enough that we need to know. We could dig deeper, but we would get a good sense of things. And if you remember, one of the takeaways that I tried to tell you at the beginning was information, database, and our interaction. So while it might be, I really have to project my voice at this juncture, that's something that you just want to think about when you see a stone that maybe you would pass by and is perhaps not as old or maybe not your style. Again, think about it a little bit longer and what can you draw from it. So let's move on to another. Someone asked me about cleaning off stones and things like that. We're talking about photographing them. If you must, if you see a really dirty stone, especially if it's someone related to you, or if you're doing a genealogy and you find someone in your heritage that you want to clean off, that's okay. The only thing we put on gravestones is water, nothing else. No chemical agents, nothing else. No soap. None of that pure, eco-friendly soap, nothing like that. Water. And a natural fiber brush. At most, I would say you could use a synthetic soft brush, like the ones that maybe you clean off your cars with in the snow, something like that, a soft bristle brush, and you lightly scrub with water, nothing else. It will take the biggest harm to these gravestones is usually us, people, knocking them over, chipping them, things like that. And then second, organically would be lichen. Lichen covers them. You can take this stuff off usually on a day after it rains or a really humid day. Your finger will scrape this right off. I mean, not your nail, your finger will take it right off. A synthetic brush or a natural fiber brush will take it off without water. But at most use water and like a natural fiber brush. I wouldn't go any further than that. Please do not be tempted to. The chemicals will eat away at the stone, especially marble, granite, and even slate. The stones, as you can see, that we looked at over there, some of them are 300 years old. They were built to last. They have done a great job lasting on their own. We really don't need to interfere that much. So somebody asked me that, I just want to caution you. They've stood here for a long time. They probably will continue to. Other things like coating them, it locks in moisture. There's a freeze-thaw effect that will crack them. So this is just things that I want to throw out there from a bare bones. So, Jerome B. Tallman, he jumps out at you. So if you can't read it, it says he drowned in saving the lives of others at the young age of 16. So what does this stone tell us informationally? What describes the manner in which he died, and it also gives us insight into the type of person he was. Heroic, brave, selfless. I mean, I don't want to drown, but I want my stone to say something like that. His father was Benjamin Tallman, I believe, who, as far as I know, owned a steamship and lived on Turnpike Avenue. Yeah, I think 79, 80, something, Turnpike Avenue.
The two Tallman houses there, in the beginning of the 20th century, they were fishermen.
Okay.
But the house that the hospital tore down that built their medical center was the Tallman house, and then the one that's still there beyond it, the Tallman house.
Right, so I'm assuming that might have been the ship that he drowned. It doesn't say anything about him drowning on a ship. I'm just making guesses here, inferences. But it'd be something, I wasn't able to find a lot of information about Jerome, but that would be an interesting case study right there. I don't know, I just think it's an interesting stone. So there's a lot of these little links into history, and especially maritime history, that you see. And so that one stuck out at me. So let's move on to another one. Another interestingly shaped stone, but I just thought it would be appropriate to reflect on an insightful commentary by a historian, Philippe Ariès, who wrote a book called Images of Man and Death. And in that book, he describes the photograph. And the photograph has taken the place held in major funerary art by sculpture. It speaks the same language, that of a family presence, a refusal to allow the dead to be forgotten. So thinking about photographs and how photographs themselves are changing from objects to this sort of invisible digital thing, and this sort of technological change that we're going through also speaks to how the preservation of objects is changing really into a sort of internet ether, basically. But it's interesting to see how we're remembering through imagery rather than words, really. The back of this stone just says Little Beat. There's really not much in the terms of biographical information. We've walked around the cemetery. We've come almost full circle. We've looked at old, medium old, new, very modern. These are two modern-ish stones. They're the first two stones when the Historical Society asked me to do a talk. We looked at a couple cemeteries, and then I drove by this one on the way, and I said, I like that one. I didn't stop in. I came back a week later with my wife, and we walked around. And this was the first pair of stones that we looked at. We were drawn here because of the portrait stone on the Ferris stone over there. And then we came over here. And we talk about everything that we've sort of talked about. The real thing that we sort of take in is that what sort of, all this information is here, and all these sort of histories that you can sort of form. And you guys are really picking up on it, right at the end there and as we're ending. And again, just picture yourself as these sort of archaeologists, anthropologists from, 300 years from now, looking at it as if, we were basically doing on those colonial era stones. And what would you derive from that? And these are just the simplest stones. I would normally pass them by. There's nothing much going on. There's some sort of not really outstanding carvings going on. But, and you might have even known these people, but I turned around to the backs and it just said something so simple to me that was kind of touching in a way. And it said, Michael B. Pages. I'm sorry. Well, it's a man, but he spelled, so it's Michelle. I think it's Michael or B. Pages and Paul Olivier Pages. Pages, right? Yes. With the accent above the E.
Well, they're the French teachers, yeah,
Okay.
from France.
So it says beloved father and husband above Michel or Miche. And above Paul's it says loving brother and uncle. So we have beloved father, husband. Loving brother, uncle. And in that, we see this sort of eternal link. They're connected not just by their proximity to each other, but also by their simple inscription as an uncle and a brother. We know that Paul most likely had no children, but that his brother's children were very important to him, because he wanted to be known, or at least his family wanted him to be known as an uncle. And we know that Miche's, the important things to him was that he was a father and a husband. And of course, most importantly, that their brotherhood was very close. And again, seeing that eternal closeness is really what bonds them together forever. Now, if these stones get moved and placed in another cemetery, that will probably be lost. But you still might be able to link them by finding one or the other and taking those simple words and putting them together. These two stones and those simple words that we would normally just walk by, having not personally known the people, prompted me to just look online, and I found like a short write-up in, I forget which newspaper, of Paul, and it was very touching, and it described his life briefly. And if you have the time, go ahead and do it. And it basically says in maybe 500 words what they've said in 3 words. And I was sort of touched by it and kind of amazed that my intuition was correct and that there was something sort of deeper and more touching here in the first stones that I saw when I came to the Portsmouth Cemetery. So in that, I will close and thank you all once again for coming here.